Buckle up, folks, because we're diving deep into the world of ancient agricultural romance. Yes, you heard that right. In a tale so riveting, so filled with heartfelt moments, and maybe just a pinch of barley, you'll question why you weren't taught the real lessons of dating in history class. Welcome to Ruth and Boaz, a quiet story of loyalty and grace, a cozy little documentary that's about as hot and heavy as two people holding hands while discussing collateral beans in grain storage. Now, you might think Bible stories are just for Sunday brunch when the mimosas kick in. But hold on to your sandals because this one's got plot twists that would put a reality show to shame. Picture this. Ruth, the ultimate go-getter, decides to stick with her mother-in-law Naomi after a traumatic loss. Talk about loyalty. Who needs Tinder when you've got loyalty and grace on your side? And enter Boaz, the nice guy of the harvest field who just happens to be rich, kind, and the type of man your mother would approve of. But hold your horses. This isn't just a fairy tale romance where everyone sits around knitting and singing about crops. No, there's undertones of survival, sacrifice, and maybe a few well-timed puns about gleaning. We'll peel away the layers of Ruth's fierce determination and Boaz's unexpected kindness. Exploring a relationship that's as down-to-earth as a farmer's market, but with way more divine intervention, or at least we hope. We'll uncover the irony of how this idyllic pastoral setting shines a light on societal issues that are still relevant today, from immigration to the importance of a solid side dish of compassion served with every meal. Who knew that grain and kindness could pave the way for a love story as profound as a Stoller-shaped footnote in history? So, settle in, grab your nightcap, and prepare to witness the absurdity of love that could only bloom in the stillness of night among the reapers, where loyalty meets grace in a dance more intricate than a sheaf-stacking competition at the county fair. Get ready, because this is a journey that might just leave you chuckling, churning your emotional butter, and wishing. Picture this. A sun-drenched Judean barley field around noon, circa ancient times. The smell is a mix of freshly cut grain and something faintly reminiscent of old sandalwood, probably from the sandals, not the wheat. Enter Ruth, a Moabite widow and unexpected role model for underdog perseverance everywhere. Across the swaying golden stalks, Boaz, a landowner who somehow manages to look both approachable and vaguely intimidating, surveys his humble domain like a benevolent landlord of an exclusive barley resort. The food of the day. Barley, the low-budget, often overlooked staple grain that doesn't even get a cereal box. Yet here it is, the backbone of rural survival and social drama alike. The lighting is bright, harsh even, summer sun beating down as if nature itself is on high alert. In the air, the low murmur of gleaners picking through the stalks, punctuated by the occasional cluck of a curious hen or the grumble of a belly that's seen better days. Ruth's arrival is no subtle entrance. It's a calculated incursion governed by unwritten gleaning protocols that border on ancient food court etiquette. She navigates the fields with a blend of grace and grit, acutely aware that every barley grain she collects is a lifeline threaded with cultural rules and neighborly suspense. Boaz, the local OG of barley oversight, enforces his domain with an almost comically meticulous eye on the gleaners, who must avoid trespassing on restricted wheat patches lest they face his well-documented harumph of disapproval. This is not just agriculture. It's a chess game where each handful of scattered grains could shift the social balance on a microscale. Legend has it that gleaning rituals involved more than just food collection. They included subtle social cues like who got offered water, who was allowed to rest under the olive trees, and the ever-important question of whether daylight savings applied, spoiler. It didn't, but the confusion was palpable. There's an almost palpable paranoia among the local gleaners that a stray barley flake could trigger a property feud, with Boaz's eagle gaze ensuring compliance. The climactic moment arrives when Boaz, breaking his usual stoic landlord act, invites Ruth to glean among his personally reserved barley stacks, effectively upgrading her from desperate widow to favored tenant. The twist? Despite this generous gesture, the barley itself remains humble and bland, a far cry from the Gato Haviat luxury foods of the ancient world. It's a subtle nod to loyalty and grace being tastier than any harvest. Historically, this gleaning practice wasn't just social welfare. It was a legally mandated property exception in ancient Hebrew law, designed to support the vulnerable and prevent famine-induced pickpocketing. This clever law probably saved many a grain-deprived soul from destitution, proving that sometimes even barley can enact social justice. The takeaway: if you ever find yourself gleaning through someone else's barley fields, remember, grace is less about the grain and more about the goodwill behind the gesture. Picture this: Bethlehem, twilight in the dusty fields where the harvesters are less like your Instagram fitness gurus and more like weary professionals caught in an endless loop of harvest and gossip. The year? An ambiguous biblical era somewhere between pottery still smells new and let's not ask about the Wi-Fi. The smell in the air? A heady mix of fresh barley, sweat, and perhaps a hint of what could only be described as existential uncertainty about the marital prospects of widows. Enter Ruth. Not your typical ancient heartbreaker, or the kind of lady who redefines loyalty by hitching herself to her mother-in-law and surviving on sheer pluck and leftover grains. The lighting is courtesy of the setting sun, casting long shadows that dramatize every cautious footstep across the grain. You can almost hear the crunch of barley beneath scuffed sandals, mingled with the distant murmur of harvesters trading stories about which one of them remembered how to bake bread without accidentally inventing a new form of charcoal. The smell of fresh-cut barley is interrupted by the occasional tisk-tug from an old guard who still believes stalks harbor invisible curses against the unmarried. At the center of this agricultural soap opera is the barley itself, humble, unassuming, and yet the centerpiece of an intricate social dance. Barley was not merely food but currency, social capital, and apparently the ancient equivalent of a dating app swipe right. Gathering barley was a perfectly respectable activity, except when it turned into an impromptu meet-cute with your wealthy kinsman redeemer, Boaz. Boaz, portrayed here as a slightly bemused, remarkably patient man of means, who knew his way around fields and eyebrow raises in equal measure. The absurdity ramps up when you realize that part of this romantic pursuit involved Ruth boldly striding into the threshing floor at night, because nothing says I'm interested like stalking your potential suitor in darkness amid stacks of grain where tripping and awkward conversations thrive. Add to this the tradition of the kinsman redeemer, a familial role that sounds heartwarming but really was an ancient contract straight out of the I'll buy your single status if you sign here playbook. And then there's the barley itself, which had its own slew of superstitions. Leaving some on the field was a divine command, but also the original anti-hunger strike. Let the poor have a chance or suffer the curse of starving scoundrels. Barley was sacred enough to cause whispers that the way you gleaned it could decide if you'd end up married or wandering the desert alone with a camel for company. At the climax, we see Ruth carefully negotiating with Boaz in a scene that is less Romeo and Juliet and more haggling at the market with a splash of destiny. Boaz's acceptance is the payoff, but it's funny how the resolution feels quieter, more like a nod over a shared loaf of barley bread than a fireworks display. The only thing more amazing than their loyalty, how little fanfare it got in the history books, probably because resolving property and family issues was the original background drama. Historically, marrying within kin groups to protect land and lineage was the ancient equivalent of a trust fund with benefits. And barley? That was the stock market of the threshing floor, fluctuating based on who was widowed, who was childless, and who had the stamina for late-night grain runs. So lesson learned? If you want a relationship grounded in loyalty and grace and a side of economic strategy, just remember, nothing says commitment like gleaning barley in the moonlight and proposing a contract. Picture it. Bethlehem, roughly 1200 BCE. The sun is setting, casting golden hues over a field that smells vaguely of freshly cut wheat and existential dread. Somewhere nearby, a tiny brook babbles incessantly, possibly trying to drown out the groans of men digging through stalks for enough grain to feed their families. Enter our heroine, Ruth. Not some glamorous warrior princess or goddess, but a Moabite widow with the tenacity of a caffeinated meerkat. On this fateful day, Ruth decides to graze in Boaz's field. Now, Boaz isn't Teak, just any landowner. He too's the town's equivalent of a billionaire six only in grain, which in ancient times was the closest thing to cold, hard cash. The air is thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and something suspiciously like roasted barley. The lighting is natural but unforgiving. Unfiltered sun highlighting the awkward social dance about to unfold. Ruth, clutching her cloak and an impressive loaf of humility, approaches the field. Boaz, perched on a wooden platform not unlike a primitive VIP box, watches, probably trying to disguise the eagerness behind his scruffy beard. The food in question? Spoils of the harvest, wheat, barley, and a generous heaping of socio-political tension. Tension mounts as Ruth ventures into a field governed by a complex set of informal but strictly observed laws about gleaning. Think Hunger Games, but with less death and more social stigma. Women gleaners are viewed with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Any contact with the landowner's servants can spiral into whispered rumors about impropriety. Boaz knows this, which is why his approach to Ruth is layered with the subtlety of a hand-woven tapestry. He offers protection, extra grain, and maybe, just maybe, a hint of future dowry negotiations. Meanwhile, the servants eye Ruth like she's smuggling contraband. In an act both magnanimous and mildly condescending, Boaz instructs his workers to leave extra grain behind. Word spread fast. The locals begin to speculate. Is Boaz simply benevolent, or is there a budding romance buried somewhere among the sheaves? This is ancient matchmaking Mecca, after all. The twist? Despite all the awkward class dynamics and cumbersome customs, Ruth's loyalty and grace quietly upend expectations. She isn't just a grateful guest. She becomes a vital player in a lineage that will one day include kings, and yes, even a certain famously giant-slaying descendant. The harvest meal? Itientu's not just about food. It is a table set for destiny. Historically speaking, gleaning laws were among the earliest social welfare policies, ensuring the vulnerable could survive without government handouts. Picture this: ancient social justice wrapped in a grain sack. Ruth and Boaz's story isn't just a love story. It weaves the original tenant-landlord negotiation with bonus romance and zero paperwork. So here too's your take-home. Loyalty and grace might not always make headlines, but they sure know how to get the grain flowing and the family tree growing. And if you ever find yourself gleaning in someone else's field, remember to bring your cloak. Picture this: Bethlehem, ancient times, golden wheat fields stretching like a never-ending buffet line, and a woman named Ruth, widowed, foreign, and apparently the original pioneer of the long walk of shame, but for virtue. The sun blazes down on the dusty ground, the smell of fresh bread mingling with the earthy scent of crops, and every rustle in the grain is a potential side-eye from the local gossips. Enter Boaz, the local landowner, who's as rich as he is unsuspecting, and probably blissfully unaware that his life will soon resemble a biblical rom-com. Ruth, clad in garments that whisper stories of far-off Moab, moves through the fields with the stealth of a seasoned gleaner and the grace of someone who knows the economy of ancient Jewish law, gleaning what the harvesters miss because food was money and dignity didn't come in sacks. She's there for one thing, survival, but destiny throws in a romantic subplot. Meanwhile, Boaz is supervising his workers, looking every bit the prosperous patriarch with a beard that could double as a bird's nest. His diet probably consists of more barley than interest in marriage until Ruth's plot-twisting appearance at his feast sparks an ancient drama-fueled spark. The air is thick with the scent of roasted grain and whispered rumors when Ruth, ever the humble heroine, drops to the ground to glean a little extra, the social equivalent of crashing a VIP party. Cue the side glances and skeptical murmurs from the younger maidens, their envy sharp enough to cut wheat. But hold on, there's a twist. Instead of a cold shoulder, Boaz throws down the hospitality gauntlet, instructing his workers to leave extra grain for Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. As if commanding a pack of medieval farmers wasn't enough, he somehow manages to make ancient harvest laws sound like an episode of a very dry soap opera. Leave some grain for the widow and the foreigner, or suffer the wrath of the Lord's social welfare program. Of course, this generosity isn't entirely altruistic. No, it sets off a series of shrewd moves involving redemption rights and marriage proposals that would put modern business mergers to shame. Gleaning grain quickly turns into gleaning hearts, as Boaz maneuvers through the ancient equivalent of prenuptial agreements with the poise of a man who's both a landowner and a very subtle romantic. Historically speaking, gleaning was not just charity. It was a legally mandated welfare system disguised as agriculture, sort of like the original social safety net, but with more dirt and fewer bureaucrats. Ruth's story gives us a peek at how kindness, legality, and romance entangle with a side of barley and wheat stalks. So what's the takeaway from this quaint love story set amidst flails and sheaves? When life gives you a harvest, don't just glean for survival. Glean for romance, social mobility, and maybe a quiet legendary status. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that behind every great man with farmland is a woman quietly Imagine it's late afternoon in ancient Bethlehem. The sun filters in a golden glow. Birds chirp a surprisingly catchy tune. And the wheat fields stretch endlessly like a rustic carpet no one bothered to vacuum. In this pastoral paradise, meet Ruth, widow, foreigner, and the original poster child for loyalty. Enter Boaz, landowner, local charmer, and agricultural mogul with a beard worthy of its own narrative chapter. The smell of freshly harvested grain mingles with the occasional waft of dust and perhaps a faint hint of goat cheese, because in ancient times, goats had absolute confidence in their aroma branding. The stage is perfectly set for a spicy tale of gleaning, grace, and a suspiciously large amount of barley. For those not in the know, gleaning wasn't just a charity gig. It was ancient Israel's answer to farmers' markets meets social welfare policy meets a low-budget Hunger Games without the actual Hunger Games. Ruth, in her determined robes and dirt-smeared sandals, stalked the edges of Boaz's fields like a less deadly but equally persistent wildlife photographer. Meanwhile, Boaz, sporting a linen tunic that says "I own this whole valley," offers Ruth protection and maybe throws in the occasional wink that could melt ancient stone tablets. But wait, don't imagine romance blooming over freshly harvested grain without a proper ritual around the food itself. Particularly barley, the unsung hero of ancient diets, which somewhat resembled modern cereal but with significantly less fun shapes and more conspiracy theories about spirits hiding in grain. Rituals abounded. Farmers believed that barley left over after harvest could attract vengeful spirits of the land, who were offended by anyone taking more than their share. Talk about a passive-aggressive ghost. Boaz's workers were warned not to whistle while working lest the barley grains crumble in fear, a superstition only slightly more plausible than drywall suddenly coming alive. Tensions rose as Ruth dipped into the gleaned grain piles under the watchful eyes of few, with neighbors exchanging suspicious glances, muttering about foreigners and their audacity to forage like peasants at a king's feast. Layered over this was the unspoken drama. Boaz's intentional generosity, the social protocols of kinship redemption, and the very real possibility that Ruth's wheat dust-covered romance might just spark a family feud or two. Then came the twist. A little midnight escapade where Ruth boldly approaches Boaz, not just to thank him, but to invoke ancient customs that mix flirting with legal claims, basically the biblical world's version of awkwardly sliding into DMs via agricultural law. Instead of scandal or scorn, Boaz responds with grace, legitimacy, and a plan to wed Ruth, turning barley fields into a quiet battleground for loyalty rewarded, inheritance secured, and foreshadowing the very foundation of a royal dynasty. Historically speaking, this tale showcases the often overlooked power dynamics in biblical agriculture and kinship systems, wrapped in the guise of simple farm work and grain gathering, but heavy with social navigation more complex than trying to assemble IKEA furniture without the manual. So, what's our takeaway? When life grinds you down to straw and barley, remember loyalty and a good sense of legal boundaries can turn gleaning into something a lot more glamorous than it sounds. Because every love story deserves at least one awkward but charming moment in a grain field. Settle in for the year 1100 BCE, Bethlehem, a town so quaint it could only be described as the ancient equivalent of your grandparents' fridge magnet collection. The sun blazes down on fields ripe with barley, an unassuming hero of the ancient world destined to spark more drama than any royal crown or battlefield conquest. The air is alive with the scents of fresh earth, roasting grain, and the subtle undertone of sheep, lots of sheep, most of which would happily eat your sandals if given the chance. Meet Ruth, a Moabite widow who's brought enough loyalty to Bethlehem to make even the most cynical reality TV show contestant look flaky, and Boaz, a landowner with a reputation so quietly generous he might as well have his own walk-in closet labeled Good Guy. Our story pivots around the humble harvest. Nothing flashy. Bundles of barley, threshing floors, and one very awkward moment of gleaning that will forever change relationship advice manuals. But before we get to romance, know this. Barley was the tinder of the ancient Near East, sparking connections, alliances, and silent bargainings over who got to pick up the leftover scraps. Historical food drama? You bet. Now, the tension ratchets up. These fields aren't just agricultural real estate. They're arenas governed by a patchwork of customs so convoluted they'd make a modern compliance officer weep. Imagine Ruth tentatively following Boaz's workers, gleaning grains while dodging norms that included everything from don't glean too close rules to if you look charming enough, you might just qualify for invitation-only leftovers. The superstitions and social codes swirling around this act of gleaning are less about crops and more about control, and the fear that a foreign widow might disrupt something so vital it might just unravel the whole social fabric. Add to that the ritualistic humility Ruth had to perform, as if she were auditioning for a part in the ancient version of The Bachelor, minus the roses and with significantly more manual labor. Then comes the big twist. Boaz not only notices Ruth, but he offers protection, food, and an arguably ancient-style marriage contract handshake that would make a LinkedIn deal look casual. The irony? This quiet gentleman's good deeds sneakily reshape the future of an entire lineage, illustrating that sometimes loyalty and grace can pack more punch than swords or thrones. Historically speaking, barley wasn't just a grain, it was the medieval equivalent of social media, a way to signal status, generosity, and sometimes romantic interest without uttering a word. So, what's the takeaway from our barley-fueled allegory? When life gives you leftover grains, glean boldly, and maybe you'll find a Boaz in your field. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that sometimes the quietest harvests yield the loudest legacy. Picture this. Bethlehem, dusk settles like a mildly inconvenient blanket as farmers shuffle about with more dust than dignity. The year is roughly 1100 BCE, give or take a scroll, and the hottest topic isn't politics, war, or prophetic visions. It's barley. Yes, barley. Because nothing says ancient romance like competing over leftover grain from a harvest party no one really wanted to attend. Cue Ruth, a Moabite with a knack for navigating stalks of grain like a celebrity navigating paparazzi. And Boaz, a landowner with enough wheat to make him the ancient equivalent of a grocery store chain CEO. The scene is set in golden fields soaked with sunset and the faint aroma of sweat, dust, and the unmistakable smell of impending social awkwardness. The clatter of sickles cuts through the chatter as Ruth quietly gleans, her every move calculated like an epic game of agricultural chess. Enter Boaz, whose gaze lands on Ruth as if he just spotted the last loaf in a famine bakery. But this isn't just casual flirting. This is ancient Israelite matchmaking fueled by loyalty and a side of legal maneuvering wrapped in the guise of generosity. Now, onto the grain. Barley, a humble cereal with the charisma of a soggy cracker, but the social weight of a royal decree. In a quirky twist, gleaning, allowing the poor to pick up leftover grain, was commanded by Torah law, which somehow transformed food scavenging into an elaborate social contract bound up in divine bureaucracy. Tensions simmer as nearby jealous relatives ponder the implications of a Moabite woman collecting barley on their land. Would this lead to land claims, unexpected weddings, or just a lot of awkward family reunions? Rituals abound. Boaz must ensure that his generosity isn't mistaken for political weakness, and by inviting Ruth to glean under his protection, he's essentially issuing a royal decree from his barley throne. Meanwhile, whispers about kinsman-redeemer obligations swirl amid the harvest stubble like a particularly nosy desert wind. The absurdity escalates when Ruth's quiet gleaning turns into a headline-worthy event, threatening to overshadow local chit-chat about goats and the annual sheep-counting festival. And just when you think it's all about feed and fields, the subplot thickens. Boaz offers Ruth a symbolic act of claiming, an ancient courtroom drama involving scarfs and footsteps that would put modern soap operas to shame. The twist? Unlike typical land grab battles disguised as love stories, Boaz plays it with surprising grace and loyalty, choosing not to embarrass the other claimant and instead setting a new standard for neighborly romance. Here's a historical nugget wrapped in a sassy tone. Barley was the staple for the common folk, cheaper than fancy wheat and dramatically less appealing to pests, making it the original budget grain. The act of gleaning was both an ethic and social safety net, proving that in ancient times, charity and millennials' obsession with thrift shopping were not so different after all. So remember, when life hands you barley, sometimes it just wants you to stick around long enough to become part of history, or at least show up in an awkward family reunion story. Picture this. Bethlehem, late Bronze Age, around 1100 BCE, amidst golden fields so expansive they practically whispered secrets to the wind, a faint aroma of freshly harvested barley, and the occasional rooster doing his best morning jazz. In the middle of this agrarian utopia, we meet Ruth, a Moabite widow with the kind of loyalty that would make your grandma weep, and Boaz, a grain magnate who owns more land than a small kingdom, sporting the most enviable beard in Judah. Now, forget Tinder. Here, romance sparks over something far juicier than swipe right. A parcel of barley grain, a commodity so precious that controlling it meant wielding power, prestige, and the occasionally awkward family dinner invitation. The atmospheric lighting is courtesy of a waning sun casting long shadows over the threshing floor, dust motes dancing through shafts of light like tiny, judgmental spirits. The scent of crushed grain mingles with the faintest hint of sweat. The byproduct of men doing what they do best, working while eyeing anyone who dares to get close enough to glean some glory. Ruth, ever the strategic thinker, steps onto this gritty stage, her footfalls muffled by the straw-strewn ground, eyes fixed on the geometrics of male hierarchy, as much as the handfuls of the barley. The food of choice? Barley, barley, and barley again. So vital that it's less a crop and more a character in this unfolding drama. But here's where things get delightfully weird. Grabbing grain from the fields isn't a casual Sunday stroll. It's a ritual steeped in unspoken rules, superstitions, and social choreography that could easily double as a reality TV show challenge. Imagine gossip whispering through the wheat like it was the hottest scandal in town. The act of gleaning itself bound by customs ensuring no one starves, but also no one leaps social ranks too fast without a side of drama. Each handful is scrutinized, a covert message in grain form. If you're lucky, Boaz drops a few ears like nods of approval. If not, well, prepare for the glare that could wither crops. There's a comic tension as Ruth navigates this agricultural obstacle course, her every movement watched by elders, workers, and potential suitors. The absurdity, a love story centered around who gets to eat what leftovers. But just when you think this dusty soap opera couldn't get any more intense, enter the plot twist. Boaz not only acknowledges Ruth, but invites her under his wing, quite literally, sheltering her from gossip and granting her access to his fields. Suddenly, the food isn't just food, it's currency, social mobility, and the original form of romantic investment. Meanwhile, the less glamorous but historically crucial footnote, gleaning laws were serious business, part charity, part social contract designed to support widows like Ruth. A savvy ancient social safety net, or just another excuse for neighbors to keep an eye on each other's grain baskets. Probably both. So, what's the takeaway from this barley-fueled romance? If you want loyalty, grace, and a future with your crush, forget flat. Picture this. Bethlehem. Twilight, dusty streets muddled with the aroma of freshly harvested barley and the unmistakable scent of neighborhood gossip, brewing stronger than any stew on the fire. The year? Somewhere neatly tucked in the Old Testament, give or take a millennium. Enter Ruth, a Moabite woman armed with nothing but loyalty, resilience, and slightly questionable fashion sense in the form of a sun-faded dress. And Boaz, our local barley baron, whose swagger barely hides his ability to spot a good deal and a good woman from 3 fields away. The scene is painted with the warm glow of sunset, casting long shadows over the threshing floor, the chatter of workers bustling to finish their gleaning before nightfall ringing through the air, a faint crunch of barley stalks crushed under eager feet punctuating the soundtrack. Ruth moves discreetly, almost invisibly, among the flurry of hands grabbing leftover grains. Grains so coveted they could have fueled a legend, or at the very least, an epic village feud. Boaz watches, partly amused, partly intrigued. Now, in this hearty blend of agricultural hustle and silent courtship, barley is no mere crop. It's currency, social glue, and apparently the original tinder, sparking rumors thicker than the bread freshly baking at the town hearth. Gleaners must follow ritualistic rules. No double dipping in the fields. No awkward eye contact, unless by accidental chance. And absolutely no stealing the rich neighbor's barley, lest you invoke the wrath of Boaz's notoriously good-tempered but fiercely protective kinsman. This barley frenzy gets pulse-pounding when Ruth, defying both social norms and probable exhaustion, accidentally stumbles into Boaz's path while collecting ears of grain, an act considered borderline treason in the Gleaner's Handbook. Gasps ripple through the peanut gallery of fellow workers. Bets are quietly placed, and the dust settles into an almost sacred hush as Boaz breaks his usual silence, not with a decree or a glare, but an invitation to share the harvest and whisper it quietly, a whispered offer of protection. And here's the twist. Boaz isn't just some wealthy farmer playing the field like it's a board game. Far from it. He steps up, orchestrates an ancient contractual dance offset by kindness and mutual respect, quietly tipping the scales of fate in Ruth's favor, and, by extension, rewriting the rulebook on love, loyalty, and the economics of leftover grain. Historically speaking, gleaning laws weren't just about charity. They were a clever social safety net ensuring community survival without turning neighbors into snack-sized villains. Ruth's story cleverly underscores this balancing act of generosity and pragmatism, proving that even harvest leftovers come with a side of drama. So the moral of our gleaning tale? Never underestimate the power of barley, whether it's in the field or fabulously woven into a love story. In the eternal contest between loneliness and loyalty, sometimes all it takes is a handful of grains and a good pair of eyes watching the horizon. And maybe, just maybe, a discreet offer to pick up where the harvest leaves off. Picture this, a sun-soaked field somewhere in Bethlehem, around 1100 BCE, where the air smells faintly of ripe barley, sweat, and the subtle undertones of dog-eared scrolls. Enter Ruth, the moody Moabite with a flair for loyalty, and Boaz, a well-to-do landowner who's about to discover ancient matchmaking disguised as agricultural policy. The setting? A dusty field scattered with leftover barley heads, not just food, but a tinderbox of social mores and romantic potential. The lighting is harsh, casting long shadows that elongate the drama far beyond the reality of crop harvesting. Sounds of rustling grain blend with the low murmur of the village gossip mill, which, honestly, is operating at maximum capacity. Now, you might think gleaning barley is about as thrilling as watching paint dry on a sandstone wall. But oh no, in this universe, each stalk carries the weight of kinship rights and unexpected marriage contracts. Ruth, gracefully awkward yet determined, stalks the fields with the subtlety of a summer breeze but the intent of a spy on a secret mission to secure future security. Boaz, meanwhile, plays the benevolent landowner, keeping an eye on his fields and Ruth's progress, possibly dusting off his wedding ring for an eventual cameo. Here's where it gets juicy, literally. The food in question? Leftover barley. Seemingly humble, but it's the medieval tinder. If you glean it correctly, it signals readiness for union and inheritance claims. But lurking beneath the golden grains is a complex web of customs so intricate even a legal scholar would ask for a glossary. There's ritualistic gleaning rules, social hierarchies enforced by the sharp edge of a sickle, and a twinge of agricultural espionage as fellow gleaners eye each other suspiciously over ears of barley. The tension escalates as village elders whisper about who holds the reins of redemption rights, while Ruth maneuvers not just for grain but for position, a classic case of power dressing with a humble shawl. Boaz, ever the genial patriarch, inadvertently turns the mundane act of harvest into a courtship dance, buttered with cryptic cultural codes and the occasional eyebrow raise that suggests, yes, he's thinking about more than just grain yields. Just when the plot threatens to settle into a pastoral rhythm, the twist. Boaz openly acknowledges Ruth's loyalty and integrity. No dramatic cliffhanger, but a quietly subversive win for romantic pragmatism. The barley isn't just food, it's the currency of grace and loyalty, wrapped up in social contracts disguised as agricultural etiquette. Historically speaking, gleaning laws were a polite way of addressing food security and social welfare, much like modern economic stimulus packages, except with more scythes and less bureaucracy. The epic here is not in battles or kings, but in quiet negotiations over rustling barley. So, what's the takeaway? When life hands you leftover grain, picture this: the dusty plains of ancient Bethlehem, 1200 BCE, so hot and dry that even the barley seemed to sweat. The sun blazes down mercilessly, scattering more dust than royal rumors. In the background, the buzzing of gossip flies around like they're sponsored by the village grapevine. The smell? A curious mix of oven-baked bread, roasted barley, and a hint of desperation, mostly from the poor. Enter Ruth, the star of our humble tale, not just any Moabite widow, but the ultimate loyalty ambassador. Her companion in this dusty drama? Boaz, a landowner whose generosity is legendary, or at least well regarded enough to keep the local harvesters fed and the sheep unmurdered. The centerpiece of this agricultural soap opera? Barley, that unassuming grain hiding more social drama than a palace intrigue. The scene is a sun-bleached field shimmering with golden stalks waiting to be harvested. The lighting is all natural, with the unforgiving sun doing its best spotlight impression, highlighting every bead of sweat on Ruth's brow and every nervous glance from the overseers. You can hear the rhythmic crunch of feet trampling the stalks, punctuated by the occasional grunt or whispered prayer to whichever deity was handy. Now, gleaning barley back then was less a casual Instagrammable farm chore and more a legally sanctioned charity caper. Widows, orphans, and other disenfranchised folks had the right to pick up leftover grain, known historically as gleaning, which naturally made fields the medieval equivalent of a free buffet with a side of social tension. Boaz, playing the generous landlord, introduces a set of rules so intricate they might as well have been written by a bureaucrat with a grudge against idle hands. Ruth, demonstrating quiet grace, follows the rules meticulously. She obediently gathers grain behind the reapers, ensuring no accidental trespassing or illicit snack breaks. Amidst this, various superstitions flourish like weeds. Some believe that a wrong step in the barley could curse the entire harvest with locusts, or worse, a sudden outbreak of snake bites because why not? So the reapers treat Ruth not just as a gleaner, but almost like a sacred talisman. Her respect and loyalty supposedly ensuring the field's fertility. Tensions rise as other gleaners eye the abundant patches Ruth is allowed to harvest. Some whisper about Boaz's motives. Is he flirting with Ruth, or just cleverly avoiding empty tables? Meanwhile, Ruth's humility and steadfastness cast a quiet shadow over the field's political theater. Then comes the twist worthy of any reality show reunion. Instead of being shooed away or reprimanded, Ruth receives an invitation to share the evening meal with Boaz and his workers, a gesture dripping with social and romantic implications, and an unexpected endorsement of Ruth's honor and character. This simple act, set against the backdrop of feasts and fields, reveals the surprising truth. In the middle of grain and grit, loyalty and grace can steal the show without a single loud proclamation. Historical fact: the practice of gleaning was revolutionary for its time, a biblical social safety net before social safety nets were a thing. It allowed vulnerable members of society to survive the harsh economic realities of agrarian life without descending into outright theft or destitution. So what did we learn from this gently scandalous barley bonanza? When life gives you leftovers in a field of wheat, play by the rules, stay humble, and sometimes generosity shines brightest in the quietest corners. The year is approximately 1200 BCE, in the sun-scorched fields of Bethlehem, a place where hospitality was as common as dust and the local crop was mostly barley, because hey, who needs wheat when you can have gritty goodness? The sun beats down mercilessly, the air thick with the scent of threshing grains, and something faintly resembling a negotiation gone wrong. Enter Ruth, a Moabite widow with a penchant for loyalty and an uncanny ability to glean barley without getting arrested for trespassing. Boaz, a man whose name means swiftness, but whose courtship strategy involves slow-eyed glances and a dubious grasp of social cues, is peacefully managing his grain fields, probably wishing for a day with no family drama. Picture the lighting: harsh golden sunlight filtered through fig leaves, shadows creeping like unwanted relatives. The sounds: rustling stalks, the occasional caw of a suspicious crow, and murmurs of local women gossiping about everyone's harvest and marital prospects. The centerpiece: barley. Yes, the serial hero nobody talks about except when it's part of a biblical love story involving legal redemption and smart land deals. This grain, humble and unassuming, is the very fabric of this pastoral soap opera. Now, before you imagine a standard romance, let's add a dash of ancient social politics. In this era, gleaning was less a charity act and more a complex social ritual bordering on controlled chaos. Farm owners tolerated gleaners like Ruth, but only just enough to maintain appearances and satisfy dusty law scrolls. Boaz's fields were not just any fields. They were the stage for a subtle duel of honor, property rights, and matchmaking protocols disguised as agricultural policy. Ancient superstition dictated that gleaners had to keep their eyes low, their hands quick, and their hearts hopeful, lest the gods punish the entire harvest with locusts or worse, social awkwardness. Imagine Boaz's inner turmoil as he spots Ruth, a foreign widow so dedicated she's practically a barley magnet, working the edges of his field. Instead of brandishing a stick or calling the guards, Boaz initiates a ritual entirely unique, inviting Ruth to eat with his workers, effectively endorsing her status, and in the process, launching a covert operation of love, redemption, and ancient bachelorette drama. The tension mounts as Ruth accepts, balancing humility and ambition like a tightrope walker juggling barley sheaves. Then comes the twist worthy of any primetime show. Boaz, who by law is obliged to secure Ruth's future by marrying her if the near kin declined, performs a subtle legal tango with another relative at the city gate, handing over his sandal as a symbolic deed. Who knew footwear could be so loaded? This tiny act shifts the entire social order, proving once again that in biblical times, romance was less about candles and more about contracts, inheritance, and the strategic transfer of grain fields. Fun historical note: the practice of gleaning was embedded deeply in community law, decreed to support widows and orphans, and unlike many modern welfare programs, it was enforced by both divine mandate and social obligation to prevent widespread famine and emotional breakdowns. Barley wasn't just food, it was economic security and social glue. So what's the moral here? If you want a love story with no awkward phone calls or ghosting, just a quiet pledge over barley fields, remember this: always keep an eye on your gleaners, because sometimes the quietest harvest leads to the loudest weddings. And if all else fails, a sandal transfer is apparently the old-school way to seal the deal. Lesson learned? Even in ancient times, imagine the dusty plains of ancient Bethlehem, circa who knows when, mostly because nobody kept receipts or calendars that mattered beyond what day the goats got nervous. The sun blazes mercilessly, and the air carries the distinct aroma of freshly harvested barley mingled with the subtle undertone of unresolved familial drama. Our scene opens with Ruth, a widow whose resume now includes humble gleaner and expert in awkward family dinners, scuttling through wheat fields with the grace of a cat burglar who just stumbled into a harvest festival. Nearby looms Boaz, a man of wealth, wit, and apparently impeccable timing. Surveying his land with the air of a guy who's pretty sure no one can claim his granaries without a legal nightmare that would make even King Solomon sigh. Lighting is naturally provided by the unforgiving sun, casting long shadows and a mood that screams serious business but really means please don't trip over that stray stalk. The buzz of cicadas percussionates the scene, while distant murmurs of a legal leviathan named the Kinsman Redeemer hang invisibly in the air like a slightly absurd yet pivotal subplot. The centerpiece of our story? Barley? Yes, humble barley. Not just food, but a symbol of sustenance, survival, and the sort of romantic entanglement that unfolds not over candlelight and wine, but over gleaned grains and dusty statutes. Tension builds faster than you can say, Boaz, you better be a decent guy. Ancient customs demand Ruth navigate the treacherous waters of the harvest season and social status with all the subtlety of a courtship dance choreographed by a bureaucracy. Superstitions abound. Don't pick up more than a few ears at a time, lest the fields curse you with eternal blisters. And beware the gaze of the overseer, part landlord, part-time detective, whose suspicion can turn a simple barley shift into a trial by ordeal. Meanwhile, Boaz employs his own rituals of generosity and legal savvy, including the dramatic public declaration that he intends to redeem Ruth's late husband's land, a gesture both economic and shockingly progressive for the day. Just as our heroine nervously waits by the threshing floor, an ancient, dusty stage for what might be the original romantic gesture or a legal power move. The unexpected happens. Boaz, instead of deploying a customary checklist of family debates and legal jargon, simply smiles and declares, "I will redeem." Cue a collective gasp from the waiting onlookers who promptly realize that kindness and loyalty might just be more binding than any contract. The barley is not only gathered but blessed by a quiet grace that sets a precedent for future awkward but heartfelt family reunions. Historically speaking, the concept of the kinsman redeemer was less hallmark and more legal obligation. Think of it as ancient inheritance law, sprinkled with a dash of do the right thing or your neighbors will gossip. Yet, in this story, divine timing and human decency align like a perfectly baked loaf, reminding us that even in dusty fields, love and loyalty could sprout like the first shoots of spring barley. So what's the takeaway from this epic tale of grain, grit, and legal redemption? Sometimes, love isn't about grand gestures, but about quietly claiming the field next to your beloved's family and making sure they don't starve. Plus, never underestimate the power of a good barley loaf when sealing deals and hearts alike. The time is roughly 1100 BCE. The place is the dusty fields of Bethlehem, where the sun scorches the earth mercilessly, and the smell of freshly threshed wheat mingles oddly with the faint aroma of old sandals. In the grand pageantry of ancient Israelite life, nothing screams romance louder than a woman stealthily scavenging leftover stalks from the harvest. Enter Ruth, a Moabite turned Bethlehemite with the stamina of a marathoner and the charm of a sheepdog. And Boaz, a wealthy landowner whose generosity might just save more than a famine-stricken village. The setting is a golden late afternoon, bathed in dusty orange light. The air is thick with the buzzing of locusts, and the rustle of wheat waving like a sea caught in a minor argument with the breeze. Ruth, wrapped in modest linen and determination, threads her way through stacks of barley gleaming like treasure. Boaz, meanwhile, marks his territory not by Twitter hashtags, but by a posse of grumpy harvesters and a seriousness bordering on sacred. At the heart of this pastoral drama, barley. Yes, the unassuming grain that stars in this love story like an old-fashioned romantic lead. Practical, wholesome, and surprisingly effective as a plot device. Tensions rise as the whole town's gossip machinery revs up. Loitering near the sheaves isn't just about picking grain, it's about social codes with the rigor of a tax audit. Ruth's presence sparks whispers. A foreign widow gleaning modestly might just be trying to snag a kinsman redeemer, the ancient equivalent of a LinkedIn connection request, but with marriage on the line. Meanwhile, Boaz practices the subtle art of looking rich and benevolent while avoiding any awkward overtures that might offend the old guard. This leads to a curious ritual. Boaz instructs his workers to drop extra barley for Ruth, an act kind-hearted yet calculated, akin to slipping a generous tip under the table but with society's implicit approval. Everyone knows this harvest etiquette is loaded with meaning, but no one knows quite how to gossip about it properly without sounding like they just watched a daytime soap opera. The absurdity peaks when Boaz arranges a spectator sport moment by inviting Ruth to sit at his threshing floor at night, a place where romance blooms under the stars and potential legal maneuverings are whispered like secrets to the wind. The threshing floor, part dance hall, part courtroom, hosts a scene that is simultaneously tender, awkward, and as charged as any modern rom-com climax. Surprise twist, Boaz's discreet proposal of marriage isn't delivered with flashy jewelry, but with the passing of a sandal, which, if you think about it, is the ancient version of sliding into someone's DMs with a shoe emoji. Historically speaking, this story isn't just a pastoral romance. It's a subtle nod to complex levirate marriage laws and land inheritance customs that kept ancient societies functioning on their delicate wheels of duty and loyalty. Moral of the tale? Sometimes, all it takes to find love is a little patience, a lot of grain, and the willingness to wear sandals in places you never thought you'd have to. In the kingdom of wheat politics, loyalty and grace go hand in hand, preferably while harvesting. Picture this: a dusty field in ancient Bethlehem, sometime around the things that made harvesting Combley's 8th era. The sun beats down mercilessly on a group of locals gathered for what may be the least dramatic grain-gleaning session in biblical history. Farmers wield sickles with all the enthusiasm of people waiting for a tax collector to pass by. The air smells faintly of sweat, sheep, and exactly 2 overripe figs someone forgot to toss out. In the middle of this agricultural snooze fest, we meet Ruth, recent widow, foreigner, and the comedic poster child for loyalty, and Boaz, the local big cheese of the barley patch, sporting a beard trimmed with the precision of a man who's definitely read a scroll or two on etiquette. The golden center of attention? A humble pile of barley grains scattered across the field, glinting like tiny yellow promises under the sun. Not just any crop strands, but the legal leftovers Ruth scrounges up by following behind reapers, a not-so-glamorous food scavenger hunt governed by strict Mosaic laws designed to make generosity a legislated affair. Think less Hunger Games, more haystacks and handouts. As Ruth stoops to snag the stray kernels, a cluster of curious eyes watch from the shadows. Barley that, close to touching a poor woman's palm, is almost scandalous, stirring murmurs that ripple like the nearby Jordan River. Meanwhile, Boaz's crew whispers about protecting their harvest from these gleaning freeloaders, but also keeping eyes on the sharp, suspiciously competent Ruth. Rumor has it she's got more grit than the Jerusalem sandstone she calls home. Historically, gleaning was a ritualistic balancing act. Leave enough grain behind to feed the destitute, but not so much that the landowner looked like a charity case or minimalist philanthropist. Some scholars speculate that farmers performed quirky ceremonies to bless the fields with good yields, involving anything from ritually tossing leftover breadcrumbs over shoulders. Yes, exactly like modern superstitions to reciting blessings that sound suspiciously like early versions of "May the harvest bless you," but not too much, because we need some for ourselves. Meanwhile, any foreigner caught picking through the stacks risked assumptions of espionage, ulterior motives, or just plain laziness, igniting an ancient cocktail of paranoia and protective localism. The tension hits an ironic high when Boaz spots Ruth deftly maneuvering through his barley like an Olympic athlete in sandals and dusty robes. With his socio-political hat on, Boaz has to decide: enforce the letter of the law and shoo her off the field, or embrace the loophole that lets him appear both benevolent and secretly smitten. Turns out, the best way to keep things quiet and classy is to drop some extra grain Ruth's way, which is basically ancient Israelite flirtation disguised as generosity. Think of it as the first recorded instance of, "Hey, I like you, here's some free food." In a plot twist worthy of daytime soap operas, this discreet barter over barley evolves into a partnership cemented by loyalty, grace, and strategically timed proposals involving less small talk and more legal transactions. Boaz, obviously a man who knows how to play the long game, uses his influence to redeem Ruth and her late husband's family property, illustrating ancient real estate drama that would make modern brokers blush. A little historical note to chew on. Gleaning laws from Leviticus weren't just ethical guidelines. They were social engineering tools designed to prevent famine, stabilize communities, and maybe control the neighborhood loaf economy. This was charity before it was cool or compulsory. So what's the takeaway from all this? When life gives you barley, make it a political statement. Also, remember that behind every quiet story of loyalty and grace is a very calculated grain game that keeps the ancient world turning, or at least makes sure no one starves while the big cheeses harvest their crops. Because sometimes the sweetest love stories start in the dirt, one stray kernel at a time. Picture this. Evening in Bethlehem, somewhere at around 1200 BCE, during the harvest season. The sun dips low, casting long, dramatic shadows over fields so golden they would inspire envy even in a modern Instagram influencer. Our heroine Ruth, recent widow and professional gleaner, think of her as the original recycler enthusiast, but with less social media and more stalks of barley, steps onto the stage. Meanwhile, Boaz, a wealthy landowner sporting a beard impressive enough to warrant its own zip code, casually surveys his domain with all the subtlety of a cat watching a canary. The air is a mix of fresh earth, sweat, and the unmistakable scent of roasted wheat. If you had to describe it in modern culinary terms, it'd be something like rustic farm totable with a hint of desperation. Ruth is there on her knees, plucking leftover grain behind the harvesters, which, in this ancient world, is as close to a supermarket sweep as you've got unless you're into serious manual labor. It's not exactly glamorous, but hey, food is food. And barley is barley, no matter how you slice it. But the plot thickens like an undercooked porridge. In this culture, gleaning isn't just charity. It's an official social system wrapped in biblical mandates and sprinkled with complex unspoken rules about who can collect what from where. Boaz, the landowner, has to perform a complex ritual of hospitality and legal brinkmanship while keeping his reputation squeaky clean. A neat trick given that everyone is watching and judging like it's the reality TV premiere of ancient Judean social politics. He flings a protective cloak of generosity over Ruth's gleaning, but not before bellowing instructions that reverberate across the fields. Lay not in your gleaning behind the sheaves, but beat off also from the bundles, and leave them for her. Basically, he commands his harvesters to be clumsier on purpose, a sanctioned mess, if you will, making sure Ruth has enough scraps to fill a small human-sized basket. The tension? Oh, it's subtle. A dance of rituals and legalities thinly disguised as kindness. Boaz has to be the generous landowner without looking like he'd be bitten by the rumor bug for encouraging vagrancy. Ruth has to glean without seeming like a professional freeloader. There's a curious paranoia about keeping boundaries. Could Ruth's presence inspire envy? Might other gleaners get wind and demand a piece too? More than once, Boaz throws a glance over his shoulder, half expecting a gleaning rebellion or a barley stampede. Meanwhile, in the background, The harvester crew grumbles and drops occasional sheaves in exaggerated fashion, like a slapstick routine to honor the law. And then, just when you've settled into the pastoral rhythm of this agricultural sitcom, Boaz directs Ruth to rest under the venerable but suspiciously shady fig tree, which, let's be honest, sounds like the opening scene to an awkward wilderness dating show. Here, Boaz drops a heap of barley, not just a few stalks, but a veritable avalanche, at Ruth's feet like parting gifts from a benevolent but socially cautious Santa Claus. This culminating gesture melds legality, generosity, and a touch of understated flirtation in one fell swoop. In a delightful plot twist, this seemingly modest act of gleaning transforms into a quiet but profound partnership bound by loyalty and grace. A reminder that even in the most ordinary tasks, the seeds of community and compassion are sown. Also, a historical footnote. Gleaning was not exclusive to Bethlehem, but a widespread ancient practice codified in Mosaic law, which, yes, probably caused many a harvester to wish they'd chosen a less complicated career. So the takeaway here? In the grand saga of life, sometimes it takes a little barley, a lot of legal theatrics, and a dash of romantic restraint to turn leftovers into legacy. And, if nothing else, remember, if you ever find yourself gleaning in a field, make sure there's a bearded Boaz around to drop a barley bomb at your feet. Because nothing says loyalty and grace quite like a sanctioned spill. Picture this: a dusty field under the merciless midday sun of ancient Bethlehem. The year is ho cars, but the crops are ripe and the drama? Surprisingly subtle for a story better known for its awkward matchmaking than its harvest techniques. The aroma? Sweet earth mixed with a suspicious hint of freshly trampled barley and probably someone's sandal sweat. Welcome to the world where loyalty and grace don't just come wrapped in fancy scrolls but are tossed about amidst the scattered remnants of wheat stalks and the occasional grumble from a grumpy overseer. Enter Ruth, a widow with the tenacity of a desert fox and the fashion sense of practical sandals and a determined glare. She's out there gleaning, that quaint ancient practice of picking up the leftovers and crumbs that even the most distracted farmers dare not claim. Then we have Boaz, the local big-shot landowner, who's less about flashy robes and more about keeping his fields productive and his reputation relatively scandal-free. Now, gleaning, for those blissfully unknowing, was not just an agricultural necessity, it was also a prime opportunity for social signaling and covert workplace romance, dressed up in the guise of charity and good ethics. Pick up enough stalks and you got food. Peek over at Ruth enduring the midday heat, and suddenly your fiduciary duties get interesting. Here's where things get delightfully ridiculous. The ancient law mandated that landowners leave behind some of their harvest for the poor. Conceptually generous, but practically a recipe for awkward encounters in fields where privacy was a myth, and every glance could spark rumors faster than a grain silo fire. Boaz, of course, couldn't just let Ruth forage in peace without a whole entourage of warnings, blessings, and veiled compliments, essentially ancient version of HR giving you the side-eye and a plant to eavesdrop. Amidst this backdrop was the curious ritual of the gleaner's blessing, a somewhat scatterbrained tradition where overseers intoned vaguely poetic but probably mangled prayers over bundles of barley, as if the gods themselves would descend to pick up the slack. Meanwhile, Ruth deftly navigated these social minefields, gathering grains like a seasoned diplomat gathering allies, all while managing to dodge the highly inefficient but zealous throwing of stones meant to keep women like her at bay. And just when you think this story might end in barley dust and polite nods, enter the famous threshing floor scene. It's less about the actual agricultural process and more about the awkward proposal wrapped in disguise that would make any modern office romance blush. Boaz is a quiet yet firm declaration of intent to care for Ruth, legally, socially, and romantically, unfolds amid a landscape of scattered chaff and increasingly confused neighbors. Historically speaking, ancient Near Eastern customs around land, marriage, and food sharing were so intertwined that you couldn't separate a romantic gesture from a contractual obligation without risking a social scandal of epic proportions. Rural matchmaking came with legal briefs, cultural scripts, and more grain than you'd find at a modern food festival. So what do we take away from this quiet yet very public tale of gleaning? Simple. If you want to show loyalty and grace, do it with a basket in one hand, a wary eye on the neighbors, and a plan for your very own awkward but binding contract. Because in the end, every romantic gesture is just another harvest to be carefully reap. And sometimes picture this: an ancient field somewhere in Bethlehem, dust swirling like soap opera drama around the lofty stalks of barley. The year? Roughly 100 BCE, give or take a couple of centuries and a prophetic daydream. The sun is blazing, as if trying to outshine the awkward tension between Ruth, the Moabite widow with a heart of gold and probably one of the first documented cases of stubborn loyalty, and Boaz, a man whose beard was more famous than his social security number. The air smells of fresh earth, sweat, and an undercurrent of something suspiciously like destiny mixed with overcooked porridge. The sun casts a warm golden glow, spotlighting the humble feast at center stage. Barley. Yes, simple, unpretentious barley, the Kardashian of ancient grains, destined to make or break reputations and lineage. Our leading lady, Ruth, is not merely foraging. She's on a mission with more layers than a political scandal. Gathering leftover grains might seem quaint until you realize these stray kernels could determine who inherits what, sparking more quiet jealousy than a village potluck gone wrong. Boaz, meanwhile, is the wealthy landowner with a penchant for justice and an eyebrow raised suspiciously at any woman not related by kin or divine promise. Enter the absurd rituals of gleaning laws, a complex, medieval meets modern bureaucracy that sounds like a bad reality show pitch. The scene reveals a rigid protocol. Gleaners must stay behind the reapers, never touch what doesn't belong to them, and definitely don't eye the overseer's lunch trays. Breaking these invisible rules would provoke social outcry akin to modern-day Twitter mobs, only with fewer hashtags and more sandals. The barley itself was rumored to be blessed by the gods of harvest, but also cursed if stolen or hoarded. Villagers performed secret handshakes, whispered incantations, and used elaborate measuring sticks to ensure everyone got their fair share. A misplaced stalk of grain was a sign of impending doom, or at least a very awkward family dinner. Just as Ruth stealthily bends to collect the last golden strands, the plot thickens. Boaz, noticing this act of understated rebellion against poverty and custom, does not shout her down or call the guards. Instead, he offers a pat on the back and a promise that sounds suspiciously like a marriage proposal, but in 12th century BCE fashion, meaning with contracts sealed by almonds and barley bread. And here's the kicker. The barley, supposedly the centerpiece of quiet sustenance, turns out to be the leading actor in an ancient tale of social mobility, romantic intrigue, and economic pragmatism disguised as faith. Historically, gleaning laws in ancient Israel were indeed a social safety net, an early version of welfare programs before bureaucrats needed offices and coffee breaks. The story of Ruth and Boaz encapsulates this delicate balance between survival and societal expectations, all wrapped up in a grainy package. So what have we unearthed here? Even in a world lit by the flicker of oil lamps and ruled by harvest schedules, loyalty and grace could be negotiated over barley, proof that sometimes the quietest stories are just as messy as the loudest dramas. Lesson learned. Never underestimate the power of leftover grains and good manners. They might just change your destiny, or at least get you a decent meal. Picture this: a dusty field under the scorching sun of ancient Judah. Circa who knows when, but definitely before air conditioning. It's the time of the barley harvest, which basically means everyone is in a frenzy to snag the best grains without tripping over their own sandals or biting into a very unfortunate thorn bush. The smells? A rustic blend of sweat, dust, and the faintest hint of hope mixed with something suspiciously like overcooked lentils. The lighting is harsh, as nature intended, with the glaring sun spotlighting our main players. First up, Ruth, a Moabite widow whose decided loyalty is more than just a catchy concept, and has followed her mother-in-law Naomi back to Judah. She's humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like a melancholy street version of a love ballad while simultaneously plotting her agricultural coup. Enter Boaz, a wealthy landowner with a beard so perfectly groomed it could have its own zip code, and an apparent talent for noticing the loyal ones gleaning grain in his fields. Think less gladiator, more ancient cowboy with a heart buried under layers of grain dust. The food of the hour? Barley. Not just any barley, but barley that holds the power to secure a future, ensure survival, and prevent awkward communal bread shortages. Barley is the MVP of ancient grains. Humble but essential. A true, unsung hero. Now, here's where the plot thickens like a poorly stirred stew. The gleaning ritual was sacred. Women like Ruth had to collect the leftover grains without causing a scene or appearing overly ambitious lest they upset Boaz or spark rumors that could end up on the grapevine. Or worse, the town square's "Did you hear?" bulletin. There were rules, of course. Ruth had to stay behind the hired hands, avoid excessive eye contact, and definitely not take the last stalk of barley in a bundle. Superstitions abounded. Some believed that stealing even a single kernel without permission would curse your family for 7 generations, a fate worse than the occasional sunburn. Boaz, meanwhile, plays the role of benevolent overseer and part-time grain Santa, tossing extra stalks toward Ruth's gathering basket like a man who's just discovered kindness, and also maybe intrigue. One can almost imagine the mental gymnastics. Is this just generosity, or a subtle ancient pickup line? The tension, palpable enough to fry an egg on the rock-hard soil. Ruth's cautious but determined. Boaz watches like a hawk who's also a fan of quiet romance. And then, plot twist. Rather than a drama-filled confrontation, Boaz invites Ruth to dine with his workers and assures her she's under his protection. No swords drawn, no scandal, just barley, basic manners, and a surreal expectation that good deeds might just be currency. Historically speaking, gleaning laws indeed existed, detailed enough to maintain social order and provide for the vulnerable, but also to keep landlords like Boaz looking like heroes without needing capes or flashy titles. So what's the takeaway from this unassuming barley saga? When it comes to ancient fields of honor, loyalty is harvested one grain at a time, and sometimes a well-timed basket of barley can lead to the quietest but most effective kind of grace. Moral of the story: picture it. The dusty fields of ancient Bethlehem, midday sun blazing like a spotlight on a stage nobody wanted to be center of, except for Ruth, the original underdog with a knack for gleaning more than just leftover wheat stalks. The air is thick with the smell of dry earth and the faint murmur of whispered village gossip, which usually revolves around how much wheat one can legally snatch without an official invitation. Spoiler alert, not much. Our leading lady, Ruth, a foreign widow with an impeccable work ethic and an even better sense of timing, tiptoes through the golden fields as if auditioning for the world's most boring ballet. Enter Boaz, a wealthy landowner who isn't just concerned about his barley and wheat yields, but also apparently moonlights as Bethlehem's most inadvertent romantic interest. The field? More than just dirt and plants. It's the medieval equivalent of a job site, a social club, and a low-key political arena. The secret ingredient in this slice of agricultural theater? The ancient law of gleaning, a legally sanctioned form of approved scavenging that would make modern dumpster divers proud. But hold your sickles. Being out there wasn't just about picking up grain. It was a cultural tightrope walk. Ruth must navigate not only the scorching sun, but also the omnipresent risk of being mistaken for a trespassing thief, or worse, a disruptive foreigner. Meanwhile, Boaz enforces his version of corporate social responsibility, albeit with sandals instead of suits, by allowing the marginalized access to his fields. The absurdity peaks when Boaz, spotting Ruth with an admirable combo of grit and grace, declares an impromptu workplace safety rule. Don't embarrass yourself or me. This wasn't just generosity. It was strategic kindness wrapped in a bow of social optics and future matrimonial negotiations. The gleaning process itself, far from a simple task, was a ballet of subtle gestures and coded compliments. Boaz's instructions to his workers to drop extra grain for Ruth to gather caused more village eyebrows to rise than a suspiciously plump camel. Superstition also played its role. Dropping wheat wasn't just an act of charity, it was a visible symbol of favor, possibly hinting at divine intervention or, at worst, future in-law approval. The entire episode unfolded with the tension of a soap opera, complete with covered heads, sidelong glances, and a sprinkle of humility so thick you could bake it into flatbread. Just when you think this drama is no more exciting than watching grain dry, the twist arrives. Boaz's invitation for Ruth to stay close by takes on layers of epic implications, transforming this gleaning ground into a prelude to a legendary love story. Rather than the expected theft accusation or a farmer's market free-for-all, we get a quietly empowering act of loyalty and grace that echoes through history. While everyone expected a wheat war, they got a wheat welcome instead. Historically, gleaning laws were a brilliant socioeconomic invention designed to maintain order while providing for widows and the poor, kind of like an ancient welfare system, but with more drama and less paperwork. The story of Ruth and Boaz isn't just romance. It's a masterclass in early social networking, community management, and the fine art of turning leftover wheat into lifelong loyalty. So what have we unearthed from the fields of Bethlehem? Picture this: the dusty fields of ancient Judah, just after the wheat harvest. Late afternoon sun lowering the curtain on a day of whispered secrets and minor agricultural drama. The air is heavy with the smell of freshly cut grain, a hint of sweat, and the occasional waft of someone roasting barley far too close to the village gossip circle. Enter Ruth, staunch, loyal, and with a knack for not just picking up leftover grain, but also overhearing who's sleeping where and why the village elder suddenly looks so nervous. Beside her, Boaz, the local landowner, towering not just in stature but in the unofficial village popularity contest. Armed with both a sharp eye for quality grain and a suspiciously kind heart. The recipe for mild chaos? Leftover grain, yes. The stalks and kernels that belonged to the harvesters but ended up on the ground, because heaven forbid a farmer misses an ear of wheat. Now, ancient Israelite law was very clear. Leave some behind for the poor, the stranger, and the widow. But what wasn't clear was exactly how much gossip one could glean between the wheat without evoking the wrath of either the farmers or the village chattering class. In true historically accurate fashion, Ruth's gleaning becomes a semi-official surveillance operation. Every rustle in the fields is noted, every casual glance exchanged, and every crumb of barley consumed by an overly friendly bird is catalogued as evidence of divine favor or impending doom. Tensions boil as the locals debate if Ruth's presence is a sign of divine justice or just plain nosiness. Meanwhile, Boaz, with all the grace of a man who knows he's being watched, sets out seemingly to protect Ruth, but really to manage the village's social balance with the deft hands of someone who's read too many scrolls on local diplomacy. The absurd ritual of offering leftover grain as a form of charity turns into a spectacle reminiscent of a bizarre courtship dance, with Boaz tossing extra handfuls to Ruth and the villagers casting suspicious sideways glances. As the sun sets and the last kernels drop into Ruth's robes, the twist. The real harvest isn't just the grain, but a quiet alliance forged in the soft glow of shared hardship and mutual respect. History note: while gleaning laws were genuinely about social welfare, it seems early rural communities also pioneered what we might call strategic kindness diplomacy, essentially networking, but with a lot more dirt under the fingernails. Moral of the story? Never underestimate the power of town gossip mixed with leftover wheat. The year is approximately 1100 BCE. The setting, a sun-baked threshing floor somewhere in ancient Bethlehem, where dust mingles with destiny, and the humble stalk of barley is the star of a drama that would make any modern soap opera look like a casual stroll in the park. The sun blazes mercilessly overhead, while the aroma of crushed grain and the faintest hint of a cow's tail swatting at flies create an atmosphere equal parts rustic charm and mild agricultural hazard. Enter Ruth, a Moabite widow with the loyalty of a golden retriever and a wardrobe that screams widowhood chic. Opposite her, Boaz, Bethlehem's version of a bachelor philanthropist, hardly a prince, but rich enough to own a field and probably a flirty eyebrow. The object of interest? A pile of barley grain, not just any barley, but the ancient equivalent of Wall Street, where fortunes are made, alliances forged, and occasional romantic pickup attempts executed amid the stocks. This barley was the medieval cryptocurrency, minus hackers, but plus lots of manual labor and idiotic superstitions. Let us set the scene. The sun guzzling the sky, the threshing floor alive with the rhythmic clatter of wooden flails beating grain, the distant sound of goats debating their life choices, and Ruth casting calculated glances that say, "I'm here to glean more than just leftovers." Now, before anyone scoffs at gleaning as the most glamorous job in history, consider that in this era, gleaning meant sifting through the fallen harvest like a medieval treasure hunt sponsored by poverty and hope. Yet, superstition loomed large. It was widely believed that barley left on the floor after harvest was protected by divine decree, and disturbing it without permission might result in a curse worse than a bad haircut in a village with only one barber. The absurdity was only matched by the social paranoia. Anyone caught scooping more than a respectable handful was instantly branded a thief, a social pariah, or worst, a marriage prospect some would rat on for the sake of a better dowry. Ruth, brave and slightly desperate, entered the fray like a stealthy archaeologist uncovering breadcrumbs of opportunity. She gleaned with the quiet determination of a cat burglar who just so happened to be a grieving widow with a heart. Boaz, meanwhile, played the role of generous landowner with the flair of a reality TV host handing out roses. He noticed Ruth's gritty persistence and decided she was more girlfriend material than footnote in the harvest report. But even this burgeoning romance was not without protocol. Boaz had to ensure Ruth's gleaning wasn't a covert barley heist. To this end, he threw in archaic blessings, protective commands, and the kind of hospitality tweets would call going above and beyond. The climax of this rural saga unfolds with Boaz inviting Ruth to refresh herself with roasted grain and water. Think ancient street food meets hydration station, unfolding under a canopy of awkward glances and community gossip faster than a town crier on espresso. And just when you think this story couldn't get more quaint, comes the twist. Boaz offers Ruth not just food but a future, stepping up as the kinsman redeemer, which loosely translates to "I'll marry you" and save the family lineage because, apparently, loyalty is a hot commodity along with barley. Historically speaking, gleaning was actually a legal right protected by Mosaic law to help widows and the poor, which elevates this story from quaint to heartwarmingly bureaucratic. So, what's the takeaway from this tale of barley, bravery, and benevolent bachelors? Always remember, when life leaves you, picture this: ancient Bethlehem, roughly 12 centuries before coffee shops and tiny hipster beards made harvest season cool. The sun is blazing like a relentless spotlight over golden fields of barley, and the air smells faintly of dust mixed with the sweet scent of freshly harvested grain and a suspicious amount of unwashed shepherds. Enter Ruth, a foreigner with a strategic sense of fashion plain but effective, and Boaz, the local landowner who probably thinks his beard makes him look wise and mysterious. The food at center stage? Barley, as unglamorous as it sounds, and utterly crucial to this drama. Now, in a world without Netflix or even a decent tavern, barley was the currency of social status and future prospects, rivaling nothing more than a good gossip session. Our story unfolds amidst whispered prayers, the occasional rustle of straw, and the ever-present cluck of chickens who clearly had better things to do. As Ruth navigates the perilous task of gleaning leftover grain, a practice equal parts generosity and social control, she must perform a delicate dance involving modesty, etiquette, and just enough boldness to keep Boaz's eyes from wandering to some less needy maiden. Local customs dictated that gleaning was sacred but also strategic. You could pick up leftovers, but never enough to provoke the wrath of landowners or local busybodies armed with more opinions than sense. Also, there was the charming tradition of leaving corners of fields unharvested to support the poor, somehow turning agricultural negligence into an ancient social welfare program. You can imagine the paranoia. Every stalk of barley ruthlessly inspected, guarded by Boaz, surly overseers who double as amateur spies. And in the midst of this, Ruth boldly approaches Boaz's threshing floor at night. A move equal parts romantic, tactical, and borderline terrifying. This quiet, dusty setting was rife with unspoken negotiations and more reading of intentions than any modern therapy session. The twist? Rather than a dramatic showdown, Boaz ends up playing the role of not just a landowner, but a gentleman suitor, swooping in to quietly redeem Ruth's family honor by buying the rights to her late husband's land. Not exactly Tinder swipes and DMs, more like a business merger sealed with whispered promises under a starlit sky. For all the apparent subtlety, this was a masterclass in loyalty, grace, and the ancient art of not making a spectacle of yourself while changing someone's destiny. Of course, the historical context behind this is that gleaning laws were one of the earliest forms of Social Security legislation. Ancient Israelite society, it seems, was into combining wheat farming with the side of grassroots welfare, though without health insurance or 401ks, so you're sort of on your own after the harvest. So, what's our concluding moral among the dusty grains and quiet romance? Sometimes loyalty and grace don't need fireworks. They just need a well-timed grain harvest, a touch of courage, and the ability to negotiate like your future depends on it. Because it absolutely does. Picture this. Ancient Bethlehem, around the 12th century BCE, under a sun so relentless it would make even an Instagram influencer's filter look dull. The scene is a golden wheat field, swaying not just with grain, but with the hopes, whispers, and borderline melodrama of a small-town harvest festival. The smell? Earthy, dusty, and just a hint of desperation mixed with overripe figs. Enter Ruth, not your average Moabite exile turned proto-feminist, who's quietly gleaning leftovers from the edge of Boaz's fields with the grace of a ninja who just realized she forgot her phone back at camp. Boaz, meanwhile, is watching over his crops and his reputation with a hawk-like gaze that says, "Yes, I'm rich, and yes, these grains are practically gold dust in human form." The tension? Oh, just the little matter of ancient Israelite inheritance laws, social stratification, and the very serious business of household loyalty disguised as agricultural charity. Now, gleaning might sound like an innocent pastime, but in this saga, it's practically a royal sport fraught with rituals that range from awkward to quasi-sacred. Women like Ruth had to walk the dusty perimeter of fields, hoping not to starve but also not to overstep into the booby-trapped territories of neighboring farmers whose uncertainty about Moabite immigrants was corporate-grade paranoia. Legend, or at least neighborhood gossip, had it that touching the sheaves directly might summon wrathful spirits or curse the harvest. So there were elaborate incantations muttered under breath, ranging from pleas to the God of Israel to mild curses aimed at anyone who'd judge too harshly. On the other side, Boaz's men wielded sickles and side-eyes equally, ensuring no one took more than their fair share, enforcing a balance between divine grace and peasant poverty. But the drama escalates when Boaz, seeing Ruth's quiet determination and glowing devotion, possibly the first recorded case of slow-burn romance, makes a move that would have HR departments today raising eyebrows. He publicly claims her as his kinsman-redeemer interest, invoking ancient texts that read like the original contract law, but with more heart and fewer lawyerly loopholes. The twist? Ruth's loyalty, initially a survival tactic, rekindles a lineage from obscurity to royalty, culminating in a genealogy that eventually features one rather famous descendant named David. So, amid sickles, whispered prayers, and borderline awkward ancient matchmaking, what's the takeaway lesson from this quiet agricultural soap opera? Maybe the ancient world was on to something. Sometimes loyalty and grace are best cultivated not with swords or scepters, but with a well-timed glean and a generous harvest. Or, if nothing else, always make sure your romantic advances include a proper legal clause. Because in the end, nothing says love like a land deed and a lunch invitation to the threshing floor. Imagine a dusty field in ancient Bethlehem, sometime long before GPS and Starbucks. Dawn breaks and the air smells faintly of sweat, dust, and what could only be described as divine awkwardness. Here we find Ruth, lately arrived from Moab, quietly lurking around barley stalks like a detective with a very patient accomplice named Boaz. Our story, famously low on fireworks and high on polite resilience, centers around the glamorous world of gleaning, the ancient sport of picking up leftover grains, an endeavor so thrilling that it could only have inspired one ancient author to immortalize it in scripture. The light is soft. Some birds chirp the old equivalent of elevator music, and the sun promises to peel the skin off anyone who dares to stand still too long. Ruth herself, a woman of remarkable determination and impeccable timing. Boaz, a man who has somehow mastered the fine art of looking both stern and kind, usually while overseeing an operation that could be mistaken for an agricultural fan club meeting. Now, the fruit of our obsession, the barley sheaf. It's the ancient commodity of choice, not quite a gold bar, but certainly the currency of social grace and redemption, especially when it comes bundled with tacit marriage proposals and the occasional promise of loyalty. But before this rural romance could unfold, there were rules, rituals that would make even the most laid-back ancient Israelite break a sweat. For instance, gleaning was more than just a humble act of charity. It was bound by laws so complex they might as well have been written on an Excel spreadsheet, except carved in stone and less forgiving. Women were to glean discreetly, men were to act as benevolent overseers, and touching said barley in the wrong way could be interpreted as an unspoken act of seduction or corporate espionage. It's a veritable minefield of agricultural etiquette, and Boaz, ever the traditionalist, positioned himself strategically, both to protect Ruth from suspicious glares and to demonstrate his status as a worthy redeemer, not just of land, but apparently of hearts. The tension peaks when Ruth, ever the clever gleaner, ends up in Boaz's field at precisely the right moment, causing neighbors to whisper and the barley to rustle with the suspense of 1,000 soap operas. What unfolds is a dance of careful conversations, courteous offers, and mutual recognition, all underpinned by a shared knowledge that barley, loyalty, and social contracts in ancient Israel are more interwoven than a hand-woven tapestry. Here's the twist. Boaz's kindness is not just a spontaneous act of generosity or proto-corporate social responsibility. It's a calculated move in the grand game of family redemption, land rights, and matchmaking with a sprinkle of divine destiny. In fact, the barley sheaf becomes less about grain and more a symbol of grace, loyalty, and even proto-romantic financial contracts, reminding us that love might be quiet, but it's never uncomplicated. Now, for a quick historical nod. Gleaning reflects ancient Israelite values around community, land inheritance, and protection of the vulnerable, so organized that they made local HOA rules look like anarchy. So, what's the moral of this humble harvest tale? In the marketplace of loyalty and grace, sometimes all you need to secure your future is a well-timed stroll through a field and the courage to pick up a few stalks of barley without causing a scandal. Or, put simply, even in history's quietest moments, there's always room for a little strategic gleaning. The sun has just risen over Bethlehem, year unknown but definitely ancient enough to make social media historians throw up their hands in despair. The smell of fresh barley mingles with the pungent aroma of early morning hustle. And somewhere nearby a goat is loudly protesting its lot in life. Our stage is set, a dusty threshing floor where the most dramatic thing about to happen is grain collection? Yes, folks, grab your sandals and dusters, because today's thriller involves stalks of cereal and a love story that unfolds at a snail's pace deserving of its own slow-motion montage. The lighting is natural and unforgiving, noon baking the earth like a midsummer barbecue. The sounds, a chorus of rustling wheat, the chatter of gleaners' women collecting leftover grain after the harvest, and the occasional gruff voice cutting through the air. Enter Ruth, a Moabite widow, with the tenacity of a debt collector and the grace of someone who's walked many dusty miles. Alongside her is Boaz, a landowner with a reputation for kindness so pervasive even the wheat leans toward his fields. Our centerpiece? Barley. Humble, hearty, and as central to this story as a good rom-com's cafe scene. But what's this? Amid the modest bustle, barley becomes a treasure worth more than gold. Legal wrangling over property rights and potential marriages hinge on it. Ancient Israelite customs mingle with personal motives. The gleaning laws, designed more for social welfare than drama, nonetheless create a theatrical backdrop for loyalty and strategic matchmaking. The barley is not just food. It's social currency wrapped in golden stalks. Adding tension, ancient customs dictate a kinsman-redeemer must protect the vulnerable by redeeming land and potentially marrying the widow. Cue awkward contracts and eyebrow raises. Boaz's quiet generosity gets a twist when he makes a public display of buying back land and rescuing Ruth. All of this while Ruth silently proves she's less a damsel in distress and more a savvy participant who knows how to play the grain game and the patience game. There's subtle flirting disguised as food gathering and laws involving threshing floors that sound less romantic and more like manual labor camps. But wait. The twist is in the threshing floor scene, where Ruth's nighttime boldness meets Boaz's equally decisive, but surprisingly gentlemanly response. What seemed like a simple ancient ritual turns out to be a well-crafted balance of respect, daring, and social maneuvering. The result? A quiet but unmistakable shift in power dynamics, where loyalty and grace ripple louder than any battlefield shout. Historically speaking, marriage customs in ancient Israel were as much about securing property and alliances as about romance. Imagine LinkedIn meets Bake Off, but with less dessert and more legal paperwork. Ruth's story survived because it was both relatable and revolutionary. A foreign widow earns her place through courage and cleverness, changing her destiny grain by grain. So what's the lesson? When life gives you barley, don't just make bread. Reimagine the whole social order. Because in a world where loyalty is the best grain and grace the finest flour, sometimes the quietest stories hold the loudest echoes. Picture the dusty fields of ancient Bethlehem, circa the Iron Age, where the sun beats down relentlessly, and every stalk of barley is as precious as the town's single public Wi-Fi hotspot. Enter Ruth, the Moabite heroine who, armed with nothing but quiet determination and a surprisingly chic headscarf, embarks on the humble but perilous task of gleaning leftovers from the harvest. Why? Because in the ancient Near East, finding a meal without offending the local landowner's paranoia was basically the equivalent of modern-day dumpster diving, but with more tithing and less Yelp. The air is thick with the scent of ripe grain, sweat, and the faint but unmistakable aroma of communal grumbling, because, naturally, no act of charity ever came free of suspicion. Enter Boaz, the local landowner and part-time romantic hero, whose job description apparently included wealthy gentleman who also moonlights as a vineyard vigilante. Lighting is harsh midday sun, shadows sharp enough to cut through social awkwardness and harvest anxiety alike. The soundtrack? The rustling of wheat, murmured prayers, and the occasional grunt of a farmer wondering why the loaf of bread always finds its way to someone else's house. Now let's talk food. Barley, the staple grain that probably inspired every middle-class dinner party starter since baked bread. But unlike your casual weekend farmer's market haul, barley in this context is less a culinary delight and more a political statement. Gleaning was codified law, a law designed to ensure the poor could eat without turning the fields into a free-for-all feeding frenzy. To breach these rules was like jaywalking, but with more severe social consequences and fewer camera phones. Tension rises as Ruth navigates this precarious system where every grain she picks is weighed not just in measures of food but in social capital and legal risk. Historical rituals dictate she must remain unobtrusive, almost invisible, harvesting kindness, not just barley kernels. The absurdity unfolds when Boaz, apparently privy to the local gossip mill and the town's unofficial food police, implements a series of oddly specific hospitality laws designed to simultaneously protect Ruth and showcase his own magnanimity. For instance, Boaz's workers are commanded not just to drop leftover barley, but to do so with excessive generosity. A phrase that probably caused much eye-rolling among the laborers who suddenly found themselves playing barley fairy. In an ironic twist, Boaz's strict adherence to these gleaning laws, motivated by a mixture of duty and a dash of social climbing, ends up weaving a safety net for Ruth. This not-so-random act of generosity ultimately leads to the quiet romance and eventual union that history remembers less for drama and more for its steadfast grace and loyalty. Back in the archives of biblical history, this gleaning law was a radical social welfare policy in its day, assuring food security through sanctioned sharing, which sounds suspiciously like the pre-modern equivalent of universal basic income, only with more mud and less bureaucracy. So what's the takeaway from all this grain shuffling and legal loopholes? When life gives you barley, don't just bake bread. Cultivate unexpected alliances and maybe a future husband or two. Because in the ancient world, the key to survival wasn't just having. Picture it. A golden afternoon in ancient Bethlehem, circa the quietly dramatic 12th century BCE. The sun beats down mercilessly, casting long shadows over fields bristling with barley, the original Bitcoin of the Bronze Age. Amidst this agricultural gold rush strides Ruth, not a typical gleaner, but rather a determined Moabite heroine with apparently impressive stamina and an eye for tall, eligible landowners. The air hums with the buzz of harvesting bees, the rustle of stalks, and the low grumbles of elders suspicious about strangers and trespassing on their sacred harvest turf. The scent? A rustic blend of earth, sweat, and the faintest hint of freshly baked barley bread. The only thing sweeter than the gossip about who spotted Ruth in Boaz's fields. Enter Boaz, the landowner with a beard as impressive as his generosity. Think less medieval CEO and more local philanthropist with a side hustle in matchmaking. He watches from atop a haystack, his eyes flicking between Ruth and his meticulously stacked grain piles, like a hawk who's just spotted a particularly juicy mouse. Now, let's talk rituals. Gleaning might sound like a simple picnic activity, but oh no. In ancient agrarian societies, it came with enough rules to rival a royal protocol handbook. First, you had to leave the edges of your field unharvested, a charitable gesture ensuring the poor could scavenge without legal infractions. But even the act of picking up those forgotten stalks carried superstitions. Some whispered that touching the first sheaf invoked the blessings of the harvest gods, while others warned that stealing a single grain led to years of bad hair days and possibly cursed livestock. As Ruth calmly navigates this minefield of religious laws and neighborhood watch groups, Boaz's servants spy her and report back, adding layers of drama to what is essentially ancient grocery shopping. To raise the stakes, local custom required gleaners to work quietly and not mingle too much, lest they tempt the jealous eyes of other workers or accidentally start a barley brawl. Ruth, however, seems to have missed the memo, or maybe she was too busy flirting with destiny, resulting in more than a few awkward glances and whispered conversations. The tension culminates one evening when Boaz invites Ruth to a quiet spot in the threshing floor, presumably to discuss terms over what can only be categorized as the most underwhelming romantic proposal in history. The twist? Instead of rushing into matrimony or political alliance, Boaz gives Ruth a symbolic gesture. A handful of barley grains and a promise wrapped in veiled language about redemption and loyalty, thus turning the humble act of gleaning into a silent epic of grace, patience, and strategic agricultural economics. Historically speaking, gleaning laws like these were some of the earliest social welfare policies disguised as divine commandments. Pretty impressive for a society that also thought menstruation required ritual isolation, and that plagues were caused by disgruntled gods with a flair for dramatic punishments. So, what's our takeaway? Always remember, in ancient times, harvesting leftover barley wasn't just about food security. It was a full-contact sport of loyalty, social boundaries, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of quiet romance. Picture this. Bethlehem. Not so ancient times. Early morning dust swirling in the air like the latest gossip, and the faint smell of freshly harvested barley mixed with desperate hope. The sun is just rising, dramatic lighting courtesy of the universe, casting long shadows over fields ripe for the picking. Amidst this pastoral landscape strolls Ruth, a Moabite widow with enough determination to outshine the more native cynics, and a hunger that's about more than just grain. Enter Boaz, a landowner whose eyes gleam not from gold but from the unexpected delight of someone actually following social customs rather than causing a scene. The plot? Ruth gleaning in Boaz's fields. Because where else do you find romance these days? On an episode of Gleaner's Got Talent? It all starts with barley, the unsung hero of ancient cuisine, the grain that sustains nations and sparks awkward social encounters. Barley, which all farmers guard like their firstborn, and all women picking it risk curses from jealous neighbors or worse, accusations of economic sabotage. Yes, ancient social drama with a side of bread and beer. But this isn't just about harvesting leftovers. It's a theatrical dance governed by laws so meticulously crafted that a misstep means instant social exile, or, at minimum, a stern parental scolding. Boaz, proud landowner and part-time matchmaker, insists on the ancient right of allowing widows to glean leftover crops. A gesture part generosity, part social insurance, with just a dash of eyebrow-raising when a foreigner shows up and suddenly has the local bachelor's attention. Because believe it or not, nothing says romance like watching someone pick stalks of grain like their life depends on it. And the rituals? Oh, the rituals. There's a sparkling, probably mythical spectacle where elders debate the legality of a Moabite woman collecting barley in a foreign field. Rituals performed with such solemnity, they make your mundane office meetings look like wild parties. All the while, local superstitions whisper that barley left on the threshing floor overnight is cursed, or that stealing a handful might bring the wrath of spirits who have nothing better to do than ruin harvests and matchmaking prospects. Tensions reach a crescendo when Ruth, after careful maneuvering and flirting with fate and social norms, catches Boaz's attention, not with a bouquet or a fancy dinner, but by respectfully following the letter of the law and likely setting new records for stoic endurance under the hot sun. Boaz's response? A dazzling mix of bewildered generosity and barely concealed smitten vibes, leading to an unexpected offer of protection and eventually a proposal of marriage that's almost as neat as the barley rows themselves. But the twist isn't just the romance. It's in the quiet revolution of loyalty and grace that Ruth embodies. In a world where outsiders are eyed with suspicion and legal texts are wielded like swords, her gentle insistence on belonging and dignity turns a simple harvest into a story that's anything but quiet. So here's a historical fun fact. Barley wasn't just food, it was currency, social glue, and apparently ancient tinder. Because when you think about it, nothing forges bonds like shared crops and mutual legal obligations. The moral? If you want to win hearts in ancient times, skip the roses, grab some barley, cling to the law, and for goodness sake bring your own water. Because in love, picture this. Ancient Bethlehem, late afternoon. The sun dips just low enough to make all the barley look like it's auditioning for a golden shampoo commercial. The fields hum with the rustle of stalks, the distant bleats of sheep, and the occasional awkward cough of a harvest worker trying not to look like he too's eyeing the gal next door. Enter Ruth, Moabite immigrant, widow, and the original queen of sticking around when everybody else checked out. She too's in the thick of the harvest. Barley in hand, determination in her stance, and probably a very dust-covered tunic. The smell? Earthy mixed with sweat, and a hint of someone else's lunch that didn't survive the heat. Across the field, Boaz, local landowner, tall, handsome, and sporting a beard that could hide an entire inventory of ancient secrets, and apparently barley grains. He too's overseeing the reapers with the casual air of a man who just heard the gods invented overtime pay but forgot to tell anyone else. The crop? Barley. Not just any barley, but the kind of barley that decides your social standing and whether your future includes a fancy Togarish feast or humble stews for the foreseeable season. Now, hold on to your sandals because barley wasn't tued, just agricultural currency. Nope, it came loaded with rituals so quirky they'd make a modern farmer reach for a good bottle of fermentation. The elderly women whispered that gleaning those stalks left over after the harvest was blessed. Basically, divine dumpster diving, but with promises of good karma and maybe a better marriage prospect. The men debated the exact angle to cut the stalks, convinced it altered not just yield but the mood of the gods, and also the breakfast options. As Ruth bends down to collect the stray sheaves, Boaz notices. Is it admiration, paternal pride, or just curiosity about this Moabite woman whose loyalty to Naomi, her mother-in-law, is borderline stubborn? Boaz, ever the gentleman in this dusty romance, instructs his workers to leave extra grain for Ruth, as if giving her scraps but secretly handing her social leverage wrapped in chaff. Of course, the townsfolk buzzed with whispers, some suspicious if the landowner's generosity was pure or a setup to snag a productive widow. Others wondered if Ruth was here just for the barley, or for a shot at the charming landowner himself. Never mind that in those days even barley could be a romantic messenger. If it was left carefully in your basket, it might mean 1. I fancy you. 2. I am loyal. 3. Let us farm the future together. But here, the twist. The local ritual that no one mentioned at family dinners. Gleaning barley was a form of social insurance, a safety net for widows and immigrants, but also a test of community goodwill. Too much gleaning, and neighbors side-eyed you as a sponger. Too little, and, well, you probably starved. Plus, Boaz's choice to notice Ruth wasn't just romance. It was savvy economics and a dash of gratitude for family loyalty. Fact check. Archaeologists confirm the ritual of gleaning did exist and was actually quite progressive for its time. It was basically the ancient equivalent of social welfare, sponsored by landowners who didn't want the village to become a collection of grumpy beggars starving next to more barley than a bakery could dream of. So next time you feel overlooked in a sea of golden fields, remember, loyalty might just earn you some extra grain. And maybe, if you tip her lucky, a charming landowner with an eyebrow for both strategy and sweetness. Moral of the story: when life hands you barley, don't just make bread. Make an offer they can refuse. Because in the game of loyalty and grace, even a grain of kindness can become a harvest of unexpected romance. As we bid adieu to our charming tale of Ruth and Boaz, one can't help but ponder humanity's bewildering delusion that we, the spindly and oftentimes silly bipeds, have any semblance of control over the animal kingdom. Train a cat? Good luck with that. Channel a goldfish's thoughts? Maybe if you have a PhD in aquatic psychology. The reality is, while we bicker over who forgot to take out the recycling, a legion of animals larger than we can fathom prepares to seize the moment. From pigeons commandeering public squares to squirrels mapping out their seemingly benevolent heists of our childhood snacks, there exists an unsung history where animals have humbly acted in the shadows, plotting their grand revenge against our folly. Recall how the ancient Greeks, those proponents of wisdom, did they not scornfully craft tales of Prometheus? A fine example of the feathered brigade swooping down on the hubristic man. History teems with tales of retribution, from rebellious dogs freeing their feline counterparts to elephants wielding their majestic trunks like the ultimate rage rooms. War horses that turned on their riders, too, should be at the top of the list. Imagine one galloping off mid-battle, deciding that its destiny lay not on the battlefield but gallivanting off to a luxurious tropical retreat. If only they'd thought to file for retirement papers first. And now, dear audience, as we turn our gaze to our own loyal companions, let us not forget the invaluable lesson lurking beneath the heartwarming fur and wagging tails. Just maybe, when you see a dog wagging his tail, perhaps it isn't joy or excitement, but rather an indication that the furry cannon is about to launch a sneak attack on that delicious chicken leg. You see, the wagging tail serves as a warning, a well-rounded indication that chaos runs deeper than we dare admit. So, as you contemplate Ruth's unwavering devotion and Boaz's unassuming kindness, remember that lurking underneath these noble human traits lies a powerful truth about our animal counterparts. They observe us, bemused, as we strut and fret our hour upon the stage, ever so determined to remain in control while they quietly plan to bring us to heel. Our true lesson this evening: if you hear a dog with a wagging tail, grab the treat, not the leash, because the only thing worse than having a pet that runs away is failing to appreciate that your pets are merely waiting for the right moment to run the show. In the end, it's not loyalty from them. It's us that they have kept under their paws. With that, I invite you to linger just a moment longer, for as you step out into the world, always remember the dog is out for more than just a stroll. Keep your chicken legs close. Vigilance shall be your virtue.